And so they said, look, it's simple. We can just go on socials and start inventing things, the whole blackmail campaign, and that will probably destroy your reputation. Or you could give us a substantial amount of money. So I'm just like, no. This was a time of taking down millennial bosses, and you're having to figure out how you're going to navigate this mentally. Something that was really nice is I realized that my friendship group, my family, my support network were incredibly stable.
Welcome to The Slowdown, your time to define success and growth for yourself on your own terms, with a little inspiration from others. Season 1 has been received so well by you, and I'm so grateful. It has had over 8,000 listens, which for a humble podcast like this, with very few people involved and no sponsorship, really means a lot. We heard from 8 guests who've all redefined success for themselves in different ways, from scaling back their businesses to taking much needed rest to going against the grain of their industry and slowing down. This season, we're branching out to reach an even wider breadth of journeys and tools, from people who've started businesses in order to support you to slow down, written books on breaking free from toxic productivity, and artists with a mission to connect us back to nature and ourselves. This podcast is really about asking questions. How can we undo childhood pressures from our families, unlearn the capitalist myth that money and power will make us happy, and ignore the endless marketing campaigns that sell us wellness? Through these in-depth conversations, The Slowdown seeks to forge new definitions of personal and professional success, providing alternative pathways to contentment. It's also the career advice I needed in my 20s but didn't get. I hope you enjoy Season 2. Our first guest is the incredible Tanguy, who's getting lots of media attention at the moment for her important new book, The Visual Detox. Marine founded a talent agency for visual artists 10 years ago, and working with some of the best artists in the world, has delivered over 300 projects across major cities, brands, and institutions. Her new book is about the 10,000 images we consume daily and has so much data-backed and eye-opening information, including how working-class areas are disproportionately bombarded with fast food and gambling ads, which in turn shapes aspirations and mental health. From cyberbullying to the cost of visibility to the intersections of policy, privilege, and well-being, this episode will make you wonder, what are we being visually sold, and how can we slow down and be more conscious consumers? Hi, Marine. Thank you so much for being here.
My total pleasure. Generally so excited.
Well, thank you for your time. You've had quite the journey through the art world, from being the youngest gallery manager in Europe at 23 to starting MTArt Agency, the first talent agency dedicated to visual artists when you were only 25. Your agency has since been listed as one of the fastest growing companies in the UK on the Sunday Times Power List and is expanding to the US and the Middle Eastern markets currently. Outside of your business, your main focus is education on topics around visual literacy and public policy. As a passionate advocate for the role of art in our society, you publish an academic paper with the Warwick University supporting a new way to value public art projects within cities. Your 3 TEDx talks are on how to transform cities with art, how social media visuals affect our mind, and how harmful the visual biases we see daily really are. Your new book, The Visual Detox, which we'll get into a lot, challenges the dominance of commercial imagery in public spaces and encourages a more active participation in our visual culture. Do you ever look back at all of those things and kind of think, wow?
Well, first of all, I feel very lucky like you because I get to do what I love. I get to be in a job that if I find an idea interesting, I can go and support it. And I think that's by far the biggest privilege because as you can see, my brain gets interested. I just get interested in artists. I get interested in projects that we could do together. We're launching so many this week that I'm really excited. But I'm ultimately someone that loves ideas and loves to support good ideas.
You could have chosen to only run your business and not get involved with any of these other topics, which I'm sure open you up for criticism and challenges. Why do you choose to be open and publicly vocal on some of these topics?
That's a very good question. I feel first, I am really into philosophy. So my first degree was philosophy in France. So I'm a double dropout. I did 2 years philosophy in France, 2 years history of art here. But I think philosophy is very much the way I approach the world. Philosophy is quite rounded. So you don't just do one application of it. You really think again at the idea at large and the impact the idea can have. So for me, it's very hard to say, I'm just going to do the business application of that vision, but I'm not going to look at the policy work or the educational work or the impact that this vision would have. That's just not the way my brain works. I'm sure it sets me up for more criticism. I feel like, again, I'm true to how my brain is thinking about things. And I also feel like, given how privileged I am today, criticism is obviously not nice to receive, but equally, I can afford for that criticism. You know, I have a great support network. I have a really settled personal life that is very supportive. I think if I fear to take on criticism, then nobody else is able to take it on, because I'm in one of the most privileged populations on this planet Earth that can vocalize opinions without feeling that I could get fired tomorrow, or I will get dumped by my husband, or I have so much freedom of speech and so much protection. So it feels also that it's the right thing to do when you are so privileged to vocalize opinions that for others will be a risk to vocalize.
And we'll speak a lot about visuals, but I would love for you to kind of paint me a visual picture of some context. Where did you grow up? Who were you raised by? I'm obviously super curious about the early formative stages in our lives where we learn what success means and the examples that we're given of what success is.
I grew up in France, in a tiny island called Ile de Ré. So this is off the west coast of France, has more birds than people. In fact, this is where birds kind of stay for a few months on their way to Africa. So it has an amazing reserve of birds. And it's very beautiful. Like, you can walk to the sea within 6 minutes of your house. You have to walk to your bus stop for 25 minutes, which then takes you to the mainland to go to high school, for instance. So very remote. That is definitely what I would say is a visual context that taught me about beauty, about how healing nature can be, how important your visual environment is. I'm sure if I was born surrounded by billboards, I probably would think very differently and write things that are very different. But then I had a contrast of people into my upbringing, which I'm all very grateful for. I had a really strong granny who was a resistant during the war. She used to hide bullets in the oysters. And she actually seduced my granddad to also get involved in the resistance. A very strong character, 6 kids, helped running the business with my grandpa. So I had, therefore, an immense protection and unconditional love for my granny, who told me that everything was possible. Also, my grandparents were in their 80s, so they just let me do pretty much everything I wanted to do. I could get out of school if I wanted to go and see the sea with them, or just go and do interesting projects. It was a total school of life in a really great way. And then I had 2 parents who unfortunately made the wrong relationship decision, which, talking about success, I think definitely from an early age informed me that is, you can make the most, sadly, terrible relationship decision that will ruin a big part of your life. They're now happy with 2 different people, but they've had 18 years that were miserable because of that decision. And that manifested itself with my mum going into depression, which meant that ultimately the house itself was ultra clean, because she had to clean everything, with absolutely no objects, no colors, and really white. So it's interesting because it's a contrast of a beautiful visual environment with a house that actually was devoid of life, and a visual representation of an unhappiness. If you kind of walk into my house to kind of picture it, there's objects everywhere. There's art, there's books, there's people, there's friends staying at my house now almost weekly. I have built a total opposite picture. And when you speak about success, when I see my kids running around and this chaotic life, vividly in colors or noise and people, I feel that I have achieved a lot through that in comparison to my childhood. So I think for sure having a granny that could run a business, that was very sharp, that could raise kids, gave me an early model that this is possible. She also had a great sense of duty. She really, it's that generation after the war where they really feel like you have to do the right thing. She actually passed away the day my book was published. She actually went into the ground the day it was published. And it's very bizarre, but very her, because she was 101. It was dedicated to her in the present tense. So it was a very bizarre day and obviously very sad, but equally quite a celebratory day because it was like almost the loop of that chapter.
It must be quite nice to have that dedication still in the present tense.
So nice. I'm actually so pleased. She didn't pass away like a few days before because we would have had to update it. And I love that she's present because I think actually even thinking about grief, like I prefer that she's present more than she's in the past, if that makes sense.
I've read that you became financially self-sufficient when you were 17. How did that happen? How did you go from that upbringing with your very entrepreneurial grandmother and your family into the world of work?
The marriage of my parents were absolutely miserable. I made a pact with my mother that I said, I'm going to leave now. And because I'm going to leave, I want you to divorce. I want you to get out because I'm not going to be able to be on site anymore. And I helped her out with the legals and she divorced when I was 17. I think I needed distance from them. As, you know, in the same way that the marriage was quite toxic, the divorce, unfortunately, was like 9 years long of toxicity as well. They didn't do that part very well on both fronts. So that independence was also something for me that to kind of figure out ultimately, how could I do things myself separately from them and figure out who I was separately to them as well. I had always been quite entrepreneurial and being from a very touristy place, I had wealthy Parisian and Anglo-Saxons staying every summer, which meant that since I was 12, I was doing babysitting with them, and I actually had put a tiny bit of money aside from that, but also mean that there were contacts from that level of people. So very quickly, I went to study philosophy, like I mentioned, at the Grande École, did loads of little jobs on the side, decided that France was, as much as I adore, and France has given me my first part of my life, unfortunately, France also taught me that whatever you study, you have to get stuck with it for 30 years. Whatever you go into, whatever box you choose, you have to get stuck in it. That didn't feel right. I was already quite flexible. I needed flexibility. I just was quite creative. And at the time, our dear Boris Johnson was saying something very different because he was saying that all entrepreneurs from everywhere should arrive to London, and diversity was being celebrated as such, and immigration was celebrated too. And the UK offered more possibilities. You could start younger. You could have your first job much younger than in mainland Europe. So I applied to BBC Culture Show. I was a waitress at Costa Coffee. I still have this weird love for the Black Forest hot chocolate that they have around Christmas because it's that kind of memory that I have from that. I also was at Harrods for the sales, which paid very well for anyone who's gone through that training and is an incredible customer service training, which paid for my internships, also meant that I could enroll into Warwick for history of art. I was good at sales. Harrods wanted to keep me, and then very quickly I was approached to kind of be a young gallery manager because I was just good at selling to high net worth. I think I didn't put them on a pedestal, and I was very quick at engaging them. And clearly I had the gift of being able to sell luxury items quite well.
And then you became a gallery manager at 23. Which gallery was that and where was that?
So that was the Outsiders Gallery. My first boss was incredible because he discovered Banksy. He's called Steve Lazarides. He discovered JR, he discovered Conor Harrington, a lot of the street art scene. I knew nothing about street art, but I love the idea of street art and what it stood for. It stood for bringing out strong conversation into the mainstream, not just being in that tiny luxury world where a few people will get to see their art, but actually really expanding those conversations and, again, kind of politically and socially taking position. So that was an incredible school, and I got to run this for 2 years until I was approached by an investor to open my own gallery in Los Angeles. So it went quite quickly from that point on, in fact. I think, I worked day or night. I talked to every single person that existed on planet Earth. Even when I was at Costa Coffee, I was distributing CVs. If I saw you wearing a suit, I assumed you had a high responsibility job because lots of people didn't wear suits where I came from. But I was very out there networking.
Where do you think that kind of drive came from?
I think it's a mix of survival because you have to ultimately look after yourself. There's no plan B. But also ignorance and naivety. I think the first part of my life is one of being ignorant, how complicated things are. And And I think it's interesting being now in a phase of my life that's more knowledgeable, but I've seen the value of both.
You then go to LA. What was that? Because I also moved to Los Angeles when I think I just turned 21, or it was just before I turned 21. And it was a very surreal culture shock experience for me. What was it like for you?
Yeah, it was definitely the same. So that investor walked into 2 galleries in London when I was managing that gallery. And the first gallery, the woman on the desk didn't address him, which happens a lot in art galleries. Then he walked into mine and I was there and straight away chatted and gave him a book. And he said, that is such a different approach to how people speak about art and engage with it. I had a feeling with my 20s that I had to make the most out of them, including sacrifices, including compromises. I'm definitely, ironically, quite an anxious person in terms of worried about what could happen next. And I think my 20s, I spent them being quite anxious and rushing things in the hope that I could consolidate some level of career, some level of reputation. Because in the back of my mind, back to success, I wanted to have kids. And I was quite... I was very certain that I would want to have them, and there was enough that timing had to be dedicated to all my hard work and sacrifices before that. So I went with LA with that mindset. My contract was really not in my advantage. I did not negotiate even the salary for myself, which was deeply stupid. But I had 50% ownership of the company. But as you know yourself, 50% of ownership, if you haven't managed a salary for yourself, is not very clever. Now, as you know, with LA, I got catapulted to Hollywood Hills, and Gary was on Beverly Hills. In a sense, you're broke, but you are in the most glamorous of environments. You've got hair and makeup and you live in this beautiful place, but you're totally broke and you have peak anxiety that you've never experienced before in terms of financial stress. I feel that it was obviously, in terms of building my character, for sure at 23, a fantastic experience like you. It's also like, and I'm sure you know, but like you're hit on by 60 plus years old guys who are all billionaires and multimillionaires because there's nothing in between. There's very little middle class that exists within this environment.
And you're fresh meat. I felt that way.
Yes, you're very much that naivety. That I would say I had to catch up with not being naive for too long, because that is not an environment where you want to stay naive for very long. But what I would say is that it has informed so much of what happened next. And I had that intuition that, one, it would put me on the map. I had been the youngest gallery manager. I was going to become the youngest gallery owner. I was going to make an insane network out of LA and positioning as well in terms of reputation. Two, I think the understanding of marketing and communication that LA has had, my sector in London was not even thinking about it. And that definitely helped us substantially as a business to then start a couple of years later. And I would say, it's kind of like, let's retain the appearances as the entire building falls apart behind you is very helpful when you run a company. Like, there has been times I've been able to walk into this room, pitch a great pitch, as actually that morning has been disastrous. Even as a parent, as you probably have been like, you've had like milk and stuff on you, but you actually retain the appearance, pitch it, and then deal with it later. I think you don't want to do it to the extreme. I think what was really hard back then is that it was mainly the appearances. But I think a little bit of that, I think, is very helpful, as you know, with all the highs and lows that you then have to navigate as a single founder.
And then how did that journey lead you into founding MTArt Agency?
So Michael Ovitz, who built one of the top talent agencies in Hollywood. So Michael Ovitz is quite known for, he was very much a man of the 80s. He was behind Steven Spielberg. He was behind like Tom Cruise, a lot of the kind of big blockbusters of the 80s in terms of the movie sector, and built one of the most powerful talent agencies. So he got curious about this young person that was starting this gallery.
Who is she? What is she doing?
It's quite different. And I think through that curiosity, initially sent me to visit his art collection, which is basically his house, but it's like this, it's not really a house. It's an insane art collection, one of the top ones in Los Angeles. His curator showed me around, and then he asked me to kind of meet up. The first time I declined because I was cooking for my artists. I love homemade cooking. And I think that kind of puzzled further Michael, that again, I was not an LA person on that. Like for me, if I had committed to making an at-home meal for my artists, I would remain to that commitment.
Which is crazy in LA because there's such a thing as bigger, better deal. Like everybody will be cancelled on because there is a bigger, better deal around the corner.
Exactly. So I feel he probably felt that like I was never going to be fully LA, but I think probably took a level of curiosity. And then as we got to know each other, I got exposed to the talent agencies world. And I think there's something that with Michael is probably misunderstood, is that he's deeply intellectual. He connects the dots like nobody else. He creates packages of people, or brains together, that then goes on creates a great creative project. And I was like, that's actually what I want to do. Of course, I love to sell the amazing productions and objects and artifacts that my artists do. But really what I love most is to create storytelling packages of the ideas and to kind of make sure there's as many partners as possible behind them. That is really what I love doing, because it's about connecting those brains, and that's much closer to my own brain. So through that, which was very tough for my first business partner, but you're 23, you're not very good at lying. I got disinterested quite quickly into what I was building because I could see that there was something else to be building. And at 23, you don't really have probably the subtlety to kind of express that. You're just very quickly into something or not into something. And that meant that at 25, I came back to London and set up the first talent agency in the art world, very much taking this idea, how can we back talents better in my space? How can we package the ideas, include audiences better, do better marketing and communication around their works, and very much broadcast their works to as many audiences as possible, all the while opening new revenue streams for them. So I think, like you, I think LA is a pivotal moment, and I'm always so grateful for it. Was it hell? Totally. But I feel it gave me 15 years of fast track. It kind of gave me so much time in advance from my sector thanks to those 2 years. So definitely worth it.
Yeah, you sort of leapfrog in some ways. What was the name of the talent agency that Michael?
CAA.
CAA, yeah. I thought it was. Huge agency. And so what amazing kind of tutelage to have had from him. But yeah, my experience of LA, as you say, is like, wow, how do you tell the difference between somebody that can be an incredible mentor and change your life and somebody that's just trying to hit on you? Yes. Is like generally a fine line.
It was the weirdest thing, and I will not quote names, but we were selling art to one of the most known actors in LA. As I brought the art, he started taking off his shirt and then jump in the pool. You're 23, you have to navigate all those situations by being like respectfully finishing the deal, then getting yourself an Uber, but still being very polite so it's not bruised ego-wise.
You then obviously come back to London. You start this amazing agency, talent agency for artists that had never been done before in that way. You're gaining in success, and then suddenly you have this slander campaign against you, which became the topic of a TEDx that you made. Why do you think that happened? What was a bit of the backstory? And then, my specific question around this is, what is the cost of visibility, especially for women, when they are founders and trying to get their name and their business out there?
So it's interesting, obviously, coming from the French culture, the French are very anti putting themselves out there. In fact, they would say it's one of the most risky thing that you can do. So even last week, I was having, again, a drink with a French founder who was like, they always come to me for advice. And I'm always like, there's going to be pros and cons. I cannot just give you the positives here. But the French are very anti. They think it's very risky. It's, as you know, the Americans are very pro. I think being in the UK, I became a mix of the two. I understood that ultimately, when I founded the company, I had no money. Like I couldn't afford a PR company. In my space, it would be 10K a month. And that's obviously huge for any kind of starting funder. Using my image meant that I could quickly get press features and I could get on the map and I could get business dev to the artist, but also control the narrative. I think that's something that is a positive. Is I think LA has tried to control what you should look like, especially as a woman, and how you should pose and how you should be. There was also something quite liberating to think that image is also something that I own, and I could control to a degree. I could tell that narrative. And I think that is something that, for us, social media kind of blossoming in that timing, it was a really big difference. We could own our own narrative. So fast forward 6-7 years, because I was pregnant with my second when this happened. Yes, I was 2.5 years ago. So fast forward 7 years later, we had hired 3 consultants in France who were underperforming for several months. So they only stayed with us 6 months, 4 months, and 2 months. So quite a short, brief period of time. We were testing the French market. And I think that is also interesting that the French were constantly the one warning me about being public, but actually not the Anglo-Saxons whatsoever, and not as much for sure. When we ended their contract because of poor performances, as you know, in the UK, someone that stayed with you just for a few months, especially at a consulting level, there's no big deal. You've kind of established objectives, you move on. French is really interesting because although you have the right to do that, and legally I'm in my rights, the perception is very different. It's not culturally accepted. And so they said, look, it's simple. We can just go on socials and start inventing things, like doing a whole blackmail campaign, and that will pick up, and that will probably destroy your reputation. Or you, because I had just raised £1 million for development in the Middle East, or you could give us a substantial amount of money, and then we call it quit. Obviously, that was blackmail. So again, being Anglo-Saxon, I'm just like, no. So at that point on that night, we shut down all the access to the emails, and then we kind of retained on our decision. It's been, for me, actually, it's been about 2.5 years of studies of the French culture too, which is a culture that actually I hadn't worked that much in, and I didn't fully understand. But actually, they were right. You could go on social media, invent absolutely crazy things. We're talking really that I was cheating every single night. My kids were not the ones of my husband.
Wow.
This is the level of what we're discussing in terms of accusations. So really like crazy stuff. And that was around the time of Anna Delvey on Netflix. You can make it a very appealing case. And
the culture was primed for another woman entrepreneur to be a crook.
Yes. And actually what's interesting is this was a peak time of taking down millennial bosses. We had just finished the girl boss culture. We had finished the lean-in culture. And there was now so much hate and despise towards those millennial girl bosses that now everyone was very happy to have done. And it was that change, exactly that timing, because if they had done it a year later, it would not have picked up. People would have been better educated about what those biases were. But I was pregnant, and they had timed it in that knowledge, because you're quite vulnerable. We all know that through pregnancy, you can be triggered more mentally. I could be reactive. I could say things that I regret. I could be emotionally damaged in ways that ultimately would be different if I wasn't. So there's a darkness to it, because ultimately you are playing with someone else's mental health resilience, which you actually have no idea about. What I would say is they did it in a time of my life where I had that resilience. I didn't know I would have had it. You never know. You're entering that situation. It's like if a whole stadium is shouting at you and you're having to figure out how you're going to navigate this mentally. But actually my life by then, and that's something that was really nice, is I realized that my friendship group, my family, my support network were incredibly stable. No team member moved, no artist moved, like my friends stayed. And actually that was a really nice thing, kind of looping back to your first question on success, is that I actually realized that the business could fail 10 times. My life was now not going to change anymore, that I had a foundation, and I was no more in survival mode. So in a weird way, it's educated me about the fact that I had changed phase in life. I was no more surviving. And that was really positive for my trust, ironically, because it made me feel that's amazing. I can take more risk in business. My success now is not reflected in my happiness personally. So that was really great. You mentioned a TEDx. I have quite an academic brain, ironically, for a double dropout, as you know. So I asked tons of questions. When this happened, I reached out to academics like Elizabeth Kadosh or others who wrote on the topic. I had questions such as, why is it 90% of those people who are women? Like, how do we understand that? And there's so much written now around rivalry of women that obviously is not the fault of women, but we're set up as a system, But I needed to understand that, because I wanted to still be pro-women, but I needed to understand, how is it that I'm getting death threats or horrible things from women?
From women, yeah.
How are we in that position? As I mentioned, I went deep onto visual biases. They kept using pictures of me that were 10 years younger. It was really interesting. It was a specific type of pictures. Ones that highlighted my jaw made me look really arrogant and very young. At no point those were pictures that actually were of the current days. It was really interesting and on purpose. So like looking at that kind of youth, arrogance, girl boss again kind of idea, almost shaping a different character of yourself visually, which goes a lot with my topic. So I became incredibly educated about the topic, as you can hear. And I'm now, if anyone goes through that, please reach out, because I've built like a support network of people who think well about this, and hopefully can help people when that happens. And I think intellectualizing it all the way looking after myself personally meant that I did not bear trauma, which I think is the reason, therefore, that I could continue as well.
It's so strong. I think, you mentioned that they came out on social media, but really the big piece was that there was an article in Le Monde, the French newspaper, that went everywhere. Yeah. They used your photo to effectively sell their newspaper. Yeah. And that's how it really proliferated and went round. Yeah. And you started to receive horrible messages and, as you say, death threats towards you from people you obviously didn't even know, strangers who didn't know you at all, and were basing their judgment based on perhaps this picture of you and this information of you. And as you said, it's fascinating to me, the visual of you. Why do you think people see a young, attractive woman and want to see her fail or like resent her? Because I listened to the TEDx and I thought it was amazing. And one of the comments from somebody was, your beauty and success are what truly trigger people.
So I think this is obviously my whole topic about visuals, as you know. What was really interesting is the context of that visual. So to take a step back, the visual that they used is when I launched a gallery in Los Angeles with Demi Moore and other celebrities. So I'm very LA. I have been put on fully hair and makeup. I've been told even in the way I should pose. And I look, therefore, very American. There's the sun behind, so it's very Los Angeles. And I'm sure you can kind of think of those pictures, very Getty, right? The French hate that. If I was to publicize this in LA, it would not do anything. Everyone would be like, that picture is like
one of a million, yeah.
But the French don't do hair and makeup the same way. The French definitely hate anything that is fake it until you make it, and all those attitudes of poses. And the French definitely don't see use. Like I mentioned, your first job in France, in my sector, is around 24 and 25 years old. You go through studies for a very long time, then you go through an internship, then you go through a job. So it's totally unrelatable. In something that actually should be relatable, which is, as you know here, you can start earlier. Suddenly, and that is always so clever with the media, they take an image that you cannot relate with. But that is upon the context, because we could have related to it if we were based in LA. We would have understood the story of that person. It was in fact quite common. For the French, it wasn't. And again, the fact that therefore I was French on top of that, and from two parents who were primary teachers, not Welsh, like it's the story itself made it completely like perfect. The picture occupies 3/4 of the article. When you go on it, there's not much information into the article. It's fully set up as a clickbait. And Le Monde at the time was trying to expand to the Anglo-Saxon world. So what they did is you could only access the article if you were to subscribe to the paper. And they targeted literally our crowd. So I kept receiving screen captures on a daily basis saying that we've been targeted. Basically, they try to get a new audience to kind of come. So it was audience acquisition.
And using your image.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it's for female funders. I mean, look at Netflix, like the top shows, Belle Gibson, Anna Delvey, Tetanus, like taking a woman down earns revenue to a Google search system, to social media engagement, up to a traditional press. And that is frightening on the economics behind that. Like Le Monde made tons of money, not tons, they made revenue through converting audiences, through the use of my image, which I didn't make a penny on because, as you know, Getty is not paying you, right?
Yeah, so, and you didn't give them permission to.
Exactly. So it's a really interesting story. I feel for me, like I mentioned on the TED, I am privileged enough that one, it was only one article. Luckily, the rest of the press researched information, refused to take it on. But second, because of my privileged setup, I could defend myself. And also it meant that what worried me is that what happens if I'm 25, I cannot defend myself, I can't afford to do that, or I don't have a voice, or I have several other biases that added to that current bias, because let's not forget I'm like white and privileged. So I have a degree of bias towards youth and being a woman, but that is not like, that is it, you know? So I think what worried me was like, if you're accumulating the biases, you're basically screwed in that system. You'll be destroyed, and you'll be destroyed mentally as well.
And you mentioned images again, and so I'd like to really dovetail straight into your book, as I have so many questions. A key data facet of the book is that we consume around 10,000 images a day. Why was that an important data point to start with?
I think it always goes back, in fact, to just the story that we talked about, is we dismiss visuals. We think they're not that relevant. This article was obviously that image way more than the text. It was that drive of that picture being a clickbait. But we never studied it. We're not visually literate. So it was really to pause and think, how many do we consume a day? But also actually, just like with kids, we don't do what our parents tell us to do. We mimic what they're doing. So what do those images make us do on a daily basis? And ultimately, how do we become more literate about that? So one, we put distance with those actions and are more empowered by the actions we want to make. But also second, that we get to be much more active in shaping the visual environment we take part in.
So I actually don't have a sponsor and there aren't any commercial breaks in this season. Instead, I wanted to use this little pause to say how much we would love to hear from you. We want to get to know our audience better. There are lots of different ways to practice slowing down and lots of different people and stories we can hear from. So please leave a comment or a review on this episode to share your thoughts. Tools you use to slow down, someone you'd like to suggest for the show, or just your thoughts on the episode. This really helps us plan future episodes and cover things that you might be interested in. Now, back to the show. I also heard you say that we hear a lot every day too, but our memory makes it easier for us to remember the visuals rather than the audio. We remember is it 60% of the images that we see versus 15% of the audio.
Yeah, we're much more visually driven, and the reason why is because images travel way faster to our amygdala. Our amygdala is the part of the brain where actually we must trigger emotionally, and this is where we store most of this imagery. And what's interesting again is that's the reason it's problematic to be visually literate, because actually we are shaped and have all those images in us, but we're not conscious of that. Like our city spaces are filled with commercial images. And actually that new desires or new consumption habit that you just picked up 2 days ago was fueled by another 10 images that you've seen over the past few days. I'm not saying you should not, you should stop all consumption. I'm saying actually you should be quite aware like how this is constantly fueled to you in your civic space, which is your public space in the city, but also on digital as well.
You highlight how working class areas are disproportionately bombarded with fast food, gambling, and fast fashion ads. What kind of impact does that have on people's daily lives and their futures?
So 4 out of 5 billboards in the UK are in working class areas. So 4 out of 5 is huge. And that's the same across the globe. So just like when you look at air pollution, visual pollution will be heightened if you are from a low income. There's loads of drastic consequences with that. One, mental health. Researchers at Warwick University studied how participants were exposed to commercial imagery, and the more exposed you are, the lower your well-being. I mean, it goes without saying that by definition, commercial imagery is trying to create new desires by telling you you're not good enough, and only if you were to consume that object or that lifestyle, you'd be better. So having an overconsumption of that cannot be good. But specifically, I think what's criminal in this context is we know that already they have less. They're going to be pushed to consumer debt, which some of them already are in that position, and they'll be pushed basically to consume products that are doubly harmful to their life and their health. This is why I like to compare it to air pollution of production, even of fashion clothing. It's like we are benefiting from their health getting worse in privileged areas. It's like kind of dual dynamics that we need to totally acknowledge. What we are suggesting, and I'm working on a white paper with UCL and Fast Forward of the 2030 UN goals, is regulations. I'm not just the one saying that. Well, last year, the Supreme Court in Switzerland ruled against visual pollution for the first time in the EU. And Bern, which is a tiny city in Switzerland, banned a lot of its commercial billboards. We need to understand, why did these companies privatize our space, made revenue on it, on land that should be public and should be a shared resource. Again, not to say that commerce or trade can't be integrated into our cities, but it can't be it. It can't be mostly what we're looking at, especially when we are pushing towards behaviors that are deeply harmful. And you've seen successes as well, where always on the positive side, When there was a ban on fast food advertising, actually the health in this country did get better. Like you see people ultimately consuming less harmful food for themselves. As a person who's downloaded the apps, fine, you've kind of relinquished all your rights to the apps who earn those rights. But a city, you are not a consumer in that city. You are a citizen. It's a civic space. You have the right to say to your council, I don't want to have that billboard up. And I think we forget that we have that right.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And policy and regulation is super important. But there are also some ways that we can personally slow down and just be more conscious of our visual consumption. Are there other things beyond civic protest and kind of policy change that you can do on an individual level?
I mean, again, this is we always go back to privileges, but we have to all acknowledge what we can and cannot do. So I live behind Oxford Street in Marylebone. So I actually never cycle or use Oxford Street per se as a street, despite being literally a few minutes down the road to where I live. I cycle everywhere, so I'm able to take the back streets. This sounds silly, but my day starts when I kind of drop the kids off at school by little streets and little businesses and people walking around and seeing nice bits of architecture, substantially different than if I was to start it with Oxford Street. I think that's a few things that you can do in terms of your commute. Obviously, certain people have an imposed commute, and I definitely don't want to kind of therefore put even more pressure on that. I think the second thing is to buy from branded businesses. We don't saturate our space with commercial images, like having an understanding of who is doing that. Coca-Cola is in our space on a constant basis, and not just in our space. Like in Africa, every time that you travel, there's a logo Coca-Cola somewhere. So there are brands who support visual pollution substantially more than others, and I think that's understanding which are the brands that don't do that ethically actually respect my visual environment. And when they do as well, they try and support it with visuals that are inspiring and representing everyone at large, having an understanding of how do the brands or businesses I buy from communicate on a daily basis visually, and whether you're aligned with that, I think is also important. After this, is I always say, because people are just always like, but do I just, not see anything? You can't. We're going to see more and more that it's just not possible. But you can also develop an emotional language around visuals that you see. Silly things like you open your phone. Right now, there's a lot going on in the world. You're likely to be triggered emotionally with what you're seeing on some of this imagery. Don't keep it. Just talk about it. The big topic of the past couple of weeks, I recently went on Sky News last week to talk about it, was adolescence. I chose not to watch it. I chose to be explained. My husband watched it. He explained to me the story plot. So I still have the understanding of the topic as word. But I knew that, especially being pregnant of my third, visually, I can't take it. I will be emotionally too triggered by that story. So acknowledging that sometimes you can't take it, and that's okay. Like your mental health fluctuates just as your coping mechanism. For me to watch the story as I'm already more sensitive emotionally is not a good idea. But I can still engage in the topic by listening to an audio about it, by being explained the story plot. So, if a visual of a wartime or anything is too hard to look at, just don't switch off the news. Just go audio. Just go to really good podcasts like Rory Stewart's, Alistair Camden have great podcasts you listen to. Have the news explained to you. And then again, I found that for me, this helps me still being engaged, but not being, very triggered emotionally.
That's actually a really good recommendation. I get most of, without actually having realized it, maybe it was subconscious choice. I get all my news through audio. I find the images, as you say, very, very triggering. You mentioned Adolescence, the Netflix British crime drama miniseries about families whose world is turned upside down when their 13-year-old son is arrested for murdering a schoolmate. I think it does currently dovetail a lot with your book because it is sort of cinematic representation of sharing the problem of our hypervisual social media culture. But what your book shows is even more nuance away from just the kind of Andrew Tate and models on Instagram, but kind of the commercial images that play into these archetypes of toxic masculinity, sexualized femininity. The questions that come from watching that show are, why is visual literacy important, and can we teach it at schools? And what really are the solutions here? Is it increasing the digital age of consent to, for example, 16, but that feels like you're kind of regulating the child? Is it about regulating the algorithm itself, so the platforms, which also seems like it's not really going anywhere with the recent kind of backwards step from regulation? Or is it parenting and schooling?
Yeah, there's quite a few answers on that. First, let's start with a positive. Millennial parents are substantially better at implementing safety tools and controls on the different apps that the kids are watching, because they're more literate, they've been digital native, they understand it. So let's not forget that we are now coming to an age where mental health is something that we understand is important, and we understand the tools that our kids are using. When I was kind of discussing the book, Gen Z and below are very well educated. They understand, again, the risk. So it's not just all of us having to wake up to it. We're already awake and we're trying to do our best, I think, on that. Jamie Miller, the main character of the show, is looking at a lot of pictures of what masculinity needs to look like, and a lot of model picture, like you mentioned. For me, what's interesting is, so I'm expecting a third boy, and obviously I'm married to my husband, Will. So there's going to be 4 boys and me.
Well,
so I actually did dive in and read the book of Boys and Men on masculinity, because I was like, I'm going to be raising boys.
Raising boys.
And I was just only with one sister, so I generally have no clue on what actually raising boys looks like. So I had plenty of questions, and I think visual representation of masculinity are so far very scarce. And I think, yes, of course, like you mentioned, Andrew Tate is an extreme, but actually, as you walk around our streets, a man is still the one that brings money, is still the one that looks a certain way, is still the one that has to show a certain type of masculinity. And that is hundreds of images that we could spot just on the way to here, on doing the podcast. So it's not just about saying it's all Andrew Tate's fault. It's saying our advertising world is not offering that much diversity. We're starting to have actors like Timothée Chalamet and others who have different types of masculinity, but it's still quite rare, and it's still also extremes where most people will find them in usually gray zones of what that masculinity actually stands for. Something that I always found really interesting, I've had the most supportive partner and husband for the past 10 years. You are always elevated as a female founder, and whenever you say, but I've got someone doing 50-50, and actually he represents, again, a completely different way to approach masculinity, that's never included in the article. This is never photographed. But I'm not the only one here to have, I know that you also are in a great partnership. I'm not the only one who is in that kind of relationship where I've had amazing men supporting me. And I've had so many different representation of masculinities through the past 17 years of my career and personal life too. So I think that is lacking visually. We're not seeing those people. Little boys need role models. They need to understand, like all of us, we want to belong, we want to be elevated, we want to be part of the social group. They're lacking this representation. And of course, populism have jumped on them as well, making it even worse at the political stage. On the other side, it's the same with women. And that's the interesting thing about visuals here too, where yes, we're told female empowerment is all really important, blah, blah, blah. But realistically, as we commute to here, we're also told the way we look like is actually substantially more important. And that we're taught that visually. And as such, and I'm always honest, I therefore put a lot of importance in it, because I understand that not just my words are going to matter, but also how I'm going to look like. We're not past really that objectification, and we don't succeed to be past it. Even the girl boss movement was so performative. You were on the high heels doing really powerful poses, but it was a very performance act of leadership. So I think both gender are stuck into their visual representation. I think hopefully that's exciting to therefore think creatively. And by working with so many creators and artists, how do we create new representations? Because we really need those. In terms of visual literacy, it definitely should be taught in school. Obviously, Finland is already doing it because the Nordics are always doing everything before us. I don't want teachers to think I need to add yet another thing to teach my kids, especially because, as we know, teachers are not really highly paid and have a lot of pressure. visual literacy could be simply beginning any topic with an image that really defined that topic. So whether it's history or geography, you could integrate it as part of the existing course, so that it's not like an extra workload. And that's something that we're working on. And visual literacy is also something that's interesting with the show Adolescence, is a lack of communication with the parents. I am not blaming the parents, because obviously this is a horrific thing. The idea even that your kid could do that is absolutely horrific. We need to develop a communication around visuals. We need to be not just about social media, because the ban, as we know, a teenager will always find a way to do what you have told them not to do. Even YouTube Kids is still releasing content that is problematic despite as many safety guards. So I wouldn't rely on that, like you say, but I would rely on communication, so that your kid, when they see representations like this, or when they see extremes of it, especially when we know that the algorithm always intensify content. So if you start with one, it keeps being increased. That communication is actually the skill set that is going to be essential, both at school, also within parents, for the boys to kind of, again, visualize role models that are different and different representation of it, but also being able to say, I am triggered by this. It goes back to triggers. It goes back to normalizing something that actually is triggering.
I just came from LA a few months ago, and we were in the LA fires of January, and it was interesting to see the footage coming out, and you could very clearly see what was an AI generated video of, you know, the Hollywood sign on fire and so on, and what wasn't. And it was creating such a maelstrom of chaos, because it made it look like all of LA was on fire, which it wasn't. And I just wonder, as AI gets better and better, how are we going to be able to know which images and videos are fake and which aren't?
Well, first of all, you say you could obviously see. I would say that 80% of people don't recognize an AI image. So I feel like I would not underestimate that most of us might not pick up on it. So that's when we get to visual misinformation. There's a few tools out there. TinEye, which is a reverse image search, meaning we see that a lot with geopolitical conflicts, for instance. An image will be put up as if that just happened today. It actually was 6 years ago in a different conflict. So I think first is understanding the source, trusting sources. The media have to step up on that. I know it's hard, but BBC launched BBC Verify. We need them to check the image that they use. I think, on 17 years of having relationship with the media, I only had one bad experience. So overall, journalists really care about what they're doing, and they really check their sources. But we need to make sure that we protect those media to check their sources better. After this is acknowledging that it's a really interesting thing, because brain-wise, we believe what we see. We think if I've seen it, that must be true. So we need to unlearn that. We need to literally think, sadly, the truth is not what I'm seeing. It's one angle, one perception, or a complete fabrication of something. But I can't just acknowledge that I've seen it. I now need to challenge it, just like opinions in the same way.
And, you mentioned one of the things that we can do is create more art projects ourselves in our cities. You do this a lot. Amazing, incredible, large-scale art pieces in cities. Are there any examples of some that you're most proud of that you think illustrate this work best?
Yes. I mean, well, I've launched one yesterday. I'm launching a few this week. So I'm lucky to have amazing examples on a constant level. But I feel something that stayed with me, that's a London example, was during COVID. So Regent Street is one of the most obviously commercialized streets. And our artist Delphine had done 14 meters of female representation away from objectification, showing that strength again of women and going past the idea that we should just be here to please as an object. And that stayed for a couple of years. It was supported by Westminster Council and the Crown Estates. But the amount of conversation it brought, I think that's why I love public art so much. And again, why I want to encourage people to think of their visual environment as a space for conversation, because all these projects have brought so many interesting conversations. I've been lucky to do the first gay and feminist festival in Saudi 6 years ago. Like that was an insane conversation. And being part of so many conversations that I think with words would have been hard, with different cultural backgrounds would have been extra hard. But actually visually you can come to it and you can come together. So we've spoken a lot about how visuals can divide, but actually having a better understanding through visual literacy, through being more active in those projects also means that actually more conversations can be created. And we all know that right now we desperately crave good conversations. So I think that's what I see a lot of public art projects, that people stop, they think, they chat with you, you have different opinions. And that's really healthy. That's actually what our civic spaces should be like.
I'm curious, just to double click on the Saudi project. 7 years ago, you were able to do a tour. 6 years ago in Saudi on LGBTQ.
So it was Gay and Feminist Festival with Vice.
How did they allow that?
Yeah, so I mean, as you know, the Middle East is pretty complicated, and it was in Alula. When Vice suggested it, I generally thought Vice is going to have like hidden cameras and they're going to make fun of me. So this is like how I did not believe it. It was just when they had lifted the ban on being able to dance in public places as well. So like even that was also not possible. Look, this was led by women. This was not done with the government, just to clarify, which is probably also why the reason it was possible. But one, as you know, Saudi, half of its population is very young. And second, there's loads of amazing women who've been educated in the West who've come back. The problem is that those are usually privileged women. So it's a class and an access socioeconomically. But we had a privileged gay and feminists who were leading that festival. We had loads of art. It was Alula. Alula had barely had any roads at the time, so they were building themselves up. And I think this is what I love my job for, is because I hopefully have very few prejudices. I have to come into that position and actively listen to something that is different to what I preconceived. And let's not forget that the media we consume is quite Western driven. I'm not saying again that those countries are perfect, but I would say that a lot of the news and even a lot of the AI imagery that is now being replicated is a specific perception of those countries.
With any kind of activism, and this truly is super relevant for advocacy and activism, it can be exhausting and feel overwhelming. How do you find ways to regulate yourself and slow down in your day-to-day to be able to take on some of these tasks?
Everything that I do and all the ideas that I support are things that I emotionally deeply care about. I feel they have to see the light of the day because that's the right thing to do. So it's a mix of passion, care, but also anger at times. Like I'm angry that those things are even in place in the first place. So those are complicated feelings. They're definitely not calm feelings. So what I've done, and that I experienced 2.5 years ago, only emphasize that I have separated my personal life. My personal life has the most mundane routines, from market on Sunday morning to play dates with my neighbors. I know most of my neighbors, to ballet, which I do almost daily. It's a very different pace of life. And I kind of read something that was recently that said, as the global world is in turmoil, the local is what makes you quite solid. Mm-hmm. My personal life has become my local, what doesn't change, what remains stable, what is very comfortable and comforting and reassuring. As I take on topics that are in turmoil and that are therefore very triggering. And that's been my biggest balance, something that I have put a lot of time and energy into. But yeah, I'm so pleased I've done that. But it's accepting, therefore, that you almost have two sides of yourself. And one is almost preserving the other. If you saw me on a daily basis in that part of my personal life, even my appearance is different. Like I just wear different clothes. It's a nice way to recharge. And that is a slower pace of life, but also one that's very routine based. There's no surprises. My professional life has surprises and changes every 5 seconds. So they are completely polar opposites. And also that's one that hopefully can raise my kids, again, being protected from this environment too.
Do you think that that also then means that where some people might need a large break, some people push themselves to burnout and exhaustion and then need a sort of retreat holiday, you actually maintain a kind of regular pace of each day that means that you don't let yourself reach a point of burnout or anything?
Yeah, so we call it with my best friend the 30 minutes to an hour holiday per day is coined by her, so Louise, not me, which is like, I don't know if it's a strawberry tart or a ballet lesson or whatever this is, or like a catch up with a friend. But the idea is twofold, it doesn't matter what happened in that day, you've had a really pleasurable, joyful moment that is outside of it. It's also very helpful when your day completely collapses and is negative, because you still have wins. Like, even when things were tough 2.5 years ago, I still took my kids to the carousel and saw my friends and celebrating things, and I have those lovely memories. So it kind of counteracts something that could also be negative. I think what has always worked is to integrate those little pleasures on a regular basis. When your identity is so confined to your work, it's a constant reminder to your brain, you're not your work. If today is all going to crap work-wise, this is not self-defining you. You can still be happy somewhere else, and your identity is not tied. And I think it's at this stage of my life, my identity is definitely not tied to my work. My work is something that I'm striving to do the very best at, but my identity is not tied with it.
I think this whole conversation has really been such a reminder that, our lives are really a reflection of our closest intimate relationships. And I think that there's definitely an LA culture of, and at least growing up in London too, a culture of like, have as many friends as possible, have this like really wide, really big network of people, have thousands of connections. But actually, that's not where wealth and joy really comes from. It comes from this much smaller, cultivated group that in times of need and in times of extreme stress, like the situation you had, will really come together and protect you, that you can trust.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, my final question, which I ask everybody, is if I had to watch one film, read one book, or go to see one piece of art, which maybe is a great one for you, that would help me understand you better, what would it be?
This is very tough. Okay, so there is an amazing movie, which I think was released around 2010, on the choreographer called Pina Bush. Pina Bush was a contemporary choreographer, and the dancers dance within everyday life. So you will see them having this most incredible contemporary ballet, but right in the middle of a big kind of brutalist building, or right in the middle of a roundabout, or right in the middle of like, I don't know, like a field. And it's full of emotions, because the way that they dance is so emotional. It's full of life as well. Like, you really understand the storytelling that kind of pace. That's the way I perceive visual arts, in a sense that I don't see it as a divide between your everyday life, and sometimes you do something nice and you look a bit about the arts. I perceive visual arts the way she did for dance, where it's not just one every 3 months at a theater. It is something that is fully integrated as a way to express yourself and into your daily life. So it's called Pina Bush. You can watch a trailer plus a movie. The music is incredible, but I think it shows you that the arts is life, more than thinking there's art and then there's life, and then maybe at some point they join.
I love that. Thank you so much for your time.
That was a really interesting conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for tuning in. This episode was hosted and created by me, Tiana Tambridge. It was produced by Whitney Rosenthal. Sound and video recording, mixing, editing and mastering is by Brazen Studios. Cover art designed by Natalia Ruche. Please subscribe to The Slowdown to be notified of upcoming episodes, tell a friend and leave a review, because it really helps a new podcast like this get out there into the world. And remember, we're all heading to the same destination, and there is no prize for getting there early, so we might as well slow down.